9 this time. I know we said that last week and we didn't make it. We only have 11 verses to cover this morning, so we should be fine. On Friday, as we were wrapping up chapter 2 in Revelation, we were discussing some of the characteristics of the church, of the way, of the faith. And we do get it in our heads often, oddly enough, that the church or our faith is kind of just static. And we weren't designed, we weren't created to be static. We're supposed to be doing stuff. We're supposed to be dynamic. We have things that we're supposed to be doing. And the question comes up quite a bit, what does some of those things look like that we're supposed to be doing? So as we're transitioning from essentially that conversion piece of Saul, we're going to be going back and looking at Peter a little bit as we finish chapter 9 and tarry into chapter 10. In verse 31, where we left off last week, we saw that the churches were being built up in Judea, Galilee, and Samaria. So now we're going to see the word kind of starting to spread elsewhere. So picking up in 32, now it came to pass, as Peter went through all parts of the country, that he also came down to the saints who dwelt in Lydda. So we saw Peter, John, the rest of the apostles kind of holding firm in Jerusalem, in the southern region. Even with all of the persecution and the hardship coming, the apostles, and no doubt with a multitude of other men and women, but we see this kind of a dispersion. A lot of the believers leave Jerusalem while that nest is kind of being shaken up. They take the word all over the place. We see Philip taking the word into Samaria. We see Philip running down the Ethiopian in the chariot. And we see the word going out. But now we see Peter, since he's already out of the nest, we don't see him being, single mindset. Well, since I'm kind of already on my way home, we might as well bounce around and spread the word. As we go through, we're going to discuss 4 things in these next 11 verses. Some of those actions, those things that make the church dynamic, as well as 2 things that slow us down in that process. So Peter, as he's moving through, he decides to go down to the saints who dwelt in Lydda. One of the things that makes the church so dynamic and so amazing is fellowship. How important a thing is fellowship. It builds us up. We enjoy having that good word and those friends, those brothers, those sisters in Christ speaking that amazing word to us, speaking that word of encouragement. Or some of us have kind of a broken rudder and our boat just kind of keeps going in circles. Whenever we get approached and someone has that word of rebuke for us, that word of rebuke typically doesn't go well. A wall goes up. And as soon as the wall goes up, what's the next thing we do? Here's our defenses. Here comes our offenses. And then we start trying to defend or justify. You don't know me. You don't know where I've been. It's interesting how a friend, a brother or sister in Christ, who is being raised up next to you, knows you, or knows you a little bit better, knows how to circumvent your defenses. One of the reasons fellowship is so important. A war buddy of mine, my discipler, my mentor, during the first tours, we didn't have anything else to do. We would do patrols, or we would do missions, or I'd have to pick up trash. But him and I would always sit down and play chess together. The only one that could beat him was me, and the only one that could beat me was him. So we'd always play chess together. We knew each other's moves. And we did that for roughly, a year, 2 years. Then we had to deploy together again. And somebody showed us a Vendetta chessboard. 4-player chess. Awesome. They just added extra lines, extra pieces. So you can play Battle Royale, all 4 people are just kind of thumping on everybody else, or you can team up, whatever it is. Well, him and I would play together. But because I knew him so well, and he knew me so well, still nobody could beat us. We just thumped them. We're essentially playing with each other's pieces. It's one of the most amazing things ever. Fellowship is important. If we deny fellowship, one, it's unscriptural, because we're told in the book of Hebrews not to forsake the gathering of the brethren, but it's good to be built up, and it's good to be built up in the right way, because we've seen that bad advice. You'll be fine. A little bit's not going to hurt you. You need to break away, take care of you, cast off everything. We've seen kind of that bad advice, but it takes a friend, someone's going to stand there in fortitude and solidarity and be like, you are doing it wrong. I love you, you're doing it wrong. How important is fellowship? What's awesome as we continue through the book of Acts, especially when we get into more of Paul's ministries, every time someone becomes a believer, we see them being baptized. What's the very next thing we typically see them doing? Come over for a barbecue. Kind of an interesting concept, isn't it? One of the first things we really latch onto when we become believers is fellowship. We should be desiring fellowship. Those of us that are not very fellowshippy, we should be ready to provide said fellowship, to be ready to teach and coach and mentor those of us that have been in the way for a while. How important that is. It's interesting that they are called saints. The word for saints is hagios, consecrated. We see the same thing in verse 31 for ecclesia, that word for church. Called out ones, that gathering. How important that is for our time now. As we had our prayer group this morning, as we were doing some of our studies last night, things are really weird right now. If you've kind of noticed the season that we're in, incredibly chaotic. As we went through the book of Daniel, as we went through the Olivet Discourse in Luke 21, as we were finishing that book, we see one of the dominant characteristics as we continue towards that day is a casting down and a trampling of the truth, a changing of the truth. What's wrong will become right, and what's right will become wrong, and we're seeing it everywhere right now. As saints, as hagios, as those that are called to be consecrated or separated unto God, one, it's important for us to not just show up on Sundays with smiley faces and pressed shirts and be holy for an hour and a half while we're sitting in front of each other, but to live those consecrated lives and to take that into our fellowship. Because there's going to be a lot of people, not just those outside the walls, but even those inside the church, with questions or trying to deal with something that is ultimately just confusing in the times that we're in now. So we see Peter going out of his way to the saints that are in Lydda. Verse 33, there he found a certain man named Aeneas, who had been bedridden 8 years and was paralyzed. And Peter said to him, Aeneas, Jesus the Christ heals you. Arise and make your bed. Then he arose immediately. Point number 2, are we ready? It's easy to be ready when we know the kind of fight that we're walking into. We know the area that we're going into. I am at point A. I'm going to point C. At point C, I'm going to be teaching or preaching, or I'm going to share the good news with somebody. I'm ready. But what happens when you get interrupted at point B? We're told to be ready in season and out of season. That word found, a lot of people really like to teach. It's like, oh, he was hunting that guy. He was wandering through the streets looking for somebody to heal or looking for somebody to minister to. Absolutely, that is an important thing to do. We should be really seeking to do those things. But that word for found in the Greek is he happened upon it. Like, oh my goodness, I found a penny. And I'm going to pick up that penny. Ready in season and out of season, because you don't know what's going to come up. Are we ready to point people to Jesus? And I really love how we see Peter. We're going to see Paul. We saw in Daniel. We see it in the book of Genesis with Joseph. How easy is it for us to reap glory that's not ours? So easy. And sometimes we do it without even thinking about it. We do it at work. We do it with our families. We want to make sure it's known. I have found myself doing it in the most ridiculous circumstances. The kitchen kind of got picked up and cleaned because I picked it up and cleaned it. But when Megan came home, I was asking the kids, like, oh, you guys did a good job picking up the kitchen. And my kids are my kids. It's like, yeah, we worked really hard today, Mom. Not really paying attention to it. So where am I from the living room? That was me. I did that. It doesn't matter. But I want the cookie. I want the gold star. And that's with something that doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. Let's look at Daniel. Let's look at Joseph. When they are essentially called to the front stage, both of them to interpret dreams. Joseph interpreting the 7-year famine dream that the Pharaoh had. Daniel interpreting the dream for Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2 about the succession of kingdoms and how his kingdom is going to fall. Both men stood to reap a lot. One was in prison, the other one was a slave taken during the Babylonian captivity. If any one of them had taken those glory for themselves, what would have happened? At least from the worldly point of view, they'd have been promoted and elevated. We saw 2 kings trying to give Daniel a third of the empire, but they didn't do that. Are we ready to point people to Jesus? So all who dwelt at Lydda and Sharon saw him and turned to the Lord. 2 amazing points. The first one is one we've kind of discussed often as we've been going through the book of Acts, how important it is to keep broken people in the church. We get awfully ashamed of our testimony, which is a silly thing. A lot of us have been, the backgrounds we have in this room would probably turn some people's hair white. But when we're showing those changed lives in the body, you're showing the power of the gospel. You're showing the power of Christ. The second point, it's okay to showcase those works. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus tells them, let your light so shine before men that they would what? Glorify God. Not glorify you, but glorify God. And we see all of these numbers, people seeing how incredible and how powerful the gospel is. And we see this large amount of people being saved who dwell in Lydda and Sharon. So we see this one person being healed, who's been bedridden for 8 years, just spreading through the area. Verse 36, at Joppa there was a certain disciple named Tabitha, which is translated Dorcas. Both those names mean deer. It's not used quite the same way that we did while we were in high school. So this woman was full of good works and charitable deeds, which she did. I like how Luke adds that last part at the end of the verse. Full of good works, full of charitable deeds. My friends, we have to be in that same place. Full of good works and full of charitable deeds. We'll see a portion of her good works and charitable deeds was making clothes for the homeless. But then it adds, which she did, which means there was good works and deeds that some people were full of, but they didn't actually do them. Which means it probably wasn't good works and deeds that they were actually full of. We see her being spawned or spurned forward to take care of these things. But it happened in those days that she became sick and died. When they had washed her, they laid her in the upper room. And since Lydda was near Joppa, and the disciples had heard that Peter was there, they sent 2 men to him, imploring him not to delay in coming to them. Not essentially one of our points for the study, but something interesting to really look at. When we see people being sent out, we see them being sent out in what? Typically in pairs. Bringing us back to that point of fellowship. We really do underestimate how powerful and how important fellowship can be. In the military, we called it a battle buddy. Always went somewhere with a battle buddy. You can fight better when you have 2 people. You're less likely to get lost when you have 2 people, generally. I remember a couple of times we had these gnarly sandstorms. Iraq, Afghanistan, you just can't see anything. So if you have to go out and use the restroom somewhere, you had to tie off to one another. So my belt would be tied to his belt, the back of my belt would be tied to somebody else. So if we all got lost, at least we did it together. At least we could still kind of survive together. But we have to really understand and come to that place of understanding as a body, as a fellowship, how important that fellowship is. Paul, in Philemon, calls one of the men with him as a fellow soldier. What a concept. A fellow soldier. That should really kind of change how you look at fellowship for you. If I am going to go with one other person into combat, I'm going to make sure he's ready to go. If he's worth his weight at all, he's going to make sure I'm ready to go. If I'm going to take a guy into combat with me who doesn't know how to use his weapon system, doesn't know how to use a radio, doesn't know how to use a compass, what is the likely outcome of said situation? Brings us back to another concept of this mentality. If we have that person, and I'm not using the word harshly, that's useless, for that particular kind of fight, what do we typically do? You stay here. I'm going to go get the other kid. We're raised in that mentality. Any of us play dodgeball or kickball or anything in school? Any of us picked first? Nice. Any of us picked first? Any of us picked last? We got to run way over there. I'll be sitting at the table. So we're kind of trained in that mentality right out the gate. Instead of taking that time and raising somebody up, spending the time with them, teaching them how to use their weapon system, teaching them how to use a compass, teaching them how to even read a map, whatever it is. You just talk on the radio. Instead of casting them off, raise them up in those things so that they can be a fellow soldier or a fellow worker, always being sent off 2 by 2. And generally, if you've got someone with you that is worth their weight in salt, they're not going to lead you into something foolish, but rather keep you out of something foolish. We also have that mentality, well, I'm better off just doing it myself. That's not the way that the dynamic is supposed to work inside the church. If you're having a problem, we have all these hotlines. Why do we have all these hotlines? Because the church just isn't ready to give a good word. It's not easy. Anybody that has called me looking for answers have known that it's even hard for me to give a good word. And I know the word. But it's one of those things we have to continue to raise people up in. Fortunately for me, I'm incredibly blessed. I have Megan. Someone who does know how to give a good word. 2 by 2s. So these 2 men, and it says that since Lydda was near Joppa, that near is kind of a relative term. Near is right about 15 miles. So the maps in the back of the Bible show both Lydda and Joppa, about a 15-mile span. They don't have cars, they don't have dune buggies. They're either on foot or they're riding an animal. 15 miles is still kind of a ways. So they get there, they find Peter, and they implore Peter not to delay in coming to them, in season and out of season. To preach the word or to teach the word or to speak the word in season and out of season, that's kind of easy. But we're told in John about no man having greater love than this, than what? Than he who lays down his life for his friends. Typically we use that verse a little bit out of context, but here we see Peter being a little bit interrupted. We have 2 men imploring him to not delay and to come immediately on a 15-mile trek the other direction. And in verse 39 it says that Peter arose and went. Peter does not delay. He doesn't banter about. He doesn't try and subvert the situation. Peter gets up and he goes. Peter arose and went with them. Our 4th point would be going the extra mile. Are we willing? These 2 men sent from Lydda went 15 miles to Joppa, and what does it say? That Peter, they don't delay, you need to come right now. It's 15 miles. Peter got up and went with them. Their 15-mile journey was 30 miles because they went back with Peter. Kind of an incredible concept. Why? 15 miles is a long way. I would show up, give him the address. I'd take my little vacation and send Peter by himself. Because we just did this little march. They wanted to guide Peter. They wanted to be a part of that fellowship going with Peter. But I believe very much it's because they, those two unnamed men, loved Tabitha. They loved Dorcas. Awesome. How much the believer means to another believer. We talk about fellowship. We talk about the body. Realistically, what are we talking about? We're supposed to be talking about family. 15 miles. They're up, they grab Peter, and they start bugging back. When he had come, they brought him to the upper room, and all the widows stood by him weeping, showing the tunics and garments which Dorcas had made while she was with them. As we've been tearing through since chapter 1 up to almost chapter 10 of the book of Acts, we've seen kind of this little waterfall of who it is that's being used. So we get this idea that the only way you're going to be used by God is if you are going to Bible college and you're educated and you're tall and you're thin and you have hair and whatever it is. Like clearly this is the model of who it is that God is going to use, because it's always been that way. So we see the apostles being used, those called from out of the upper room, and they just take it out. We see this amazing ministry that the apostles have. But then it drifts a little bit from apostles, and then we start seeing disciples being used. People that are students, diehard students, and those pursuing Christ. Clearly apostles are going to be used, and clearly disciples are going to be used, but nobody else. And now we come to Tabitha. Now we come to Dorcas. So while she was a disciple, what is it they're showing Peter? What does Peter see when he shows up on scene and everybody is weeping? This is what she taught us. This is what she had shown us. This is the example she left us from. That's not what they're seeing, is it? They're holding tunics. They're holding clothes. This is what she made. This is what she had done for our community. It shows the dynamic of the fellowship. A portion of just the churches as a whole see ministry as two things. You're either the pastor or you're up here for worship. When the church is far more manifold than that. She's making clothes. I mean, the amount of ministries in the church alone, even the small fellowship, I'd say round about 30, with only like 4 of them being filled right now. Hint, hint. If anybody wants to serve, we have contact cards in the back. But we have all these amazing things that kind of just help the machine continue on its way and continue to move. And I just really love how the Word always shows the kind of people that God uses. Not many wise, not many mighty are called. But Peter put them out and knelt down and prayed, and turning to the body, to Tabitha's body, he said, "Tabitha, arise." And she opened her eyes when she saw Peter, and she sat up. Why did Peter have the people be removed? I've seen it in jest, which granted it's funny. If you're going to speak to a body, you probably want to do it in a room full of witnesses. But why did Peter put them out? The same reason that we should be doing certain things while we're in our ministry, in our walk, we need to remove distractions. We know that some people were there who knew Tabitha, who were showing the garments, but we've also known, as we've tarried through the Gospels, that what happens when somebody dies? They hire a slew of professional mourners. The more professional mourners you had there on site, the more special that person was. Kind of in a way, one, it's showing everybody else how much they meant, but also that person, that deceased, would hear all of those cries and lamentations and just know that they were loved. So there was a ton of them. Somebody weeping is already a distraction. I'm not saying that in a bad way. But their heart hurts. They are mourning. They are crying. Some people have pretty cries. Some people not so much. But then you deal with professional mourners who are essentially being paid to make sure other people know somebody died. What does that look like? I'm not going to do it, but it can't be pretty. Those kind of distractions, while he's trying to do something that requires much of his focus, he's removing it. My friends, we need to come to a place of removing our distractions. What does our distractions look like right now? More often than not, it's either time with the TV or time in our phones. The general consensus is about that right now. Or it's our hobbies. Those of us that work 6 days out of the week, 5 days out of the week, what do we want to do the last 2 days? Not sit down in our prayer closet, or not sit down behind the Word. Instead, we take it to the lake, or we take it to the woods, or we take it to our vehicles, or our gardening beds, whatever it is. We try and fill our time more with that. And then when we pray, it's like, Lord, how come I could feel myself distancing from you? Distractions. Far too many distractions. Another interesting thing about Tabitha. Well, we'll get to that point. Verse 41, then he gave her his hand and lifted her up. And when he had called the saints and widows, he presented her alive. So he kneels down and he prays. And what's interesting is, does this verse kind of seem familiar at all? Remember Jesus being implored to go and heal the daughter. And it was an urgent matter, had to be done. But on his way to heal the daughter, the hem of Jesus' cloak gets touched, and another woman is healed, so he stops in his tracks and he's asking who touched, and then we find out that the daughter was dead, and he finally goes up and he says, Talitha Kumi, meaning little girl, rise. We see him as he steps on scene, Jesus dealing with all the professional mourners, all the same people. And what does Jesus do? He removes them from the room. We see Peter doing the same thing that Jesus is doing. A couple of years later, roughly 3 years, 4 years later, we see Peter doing things the same way he saw Jesus doing it. My friends, who is our teacher and who is our example? Most of the time we're dealing with quotes or whatever it is. It's like, well, this is what Tozer said. This is what Spurgeon said. Because we read it in our devotional. How much harder is it to go back to what Jesus said? Typically, there's more pages in the Bible than there is in the devotional, so one seems easier than the other one. So we just start pulling from the easier one. But we see Peter going right back to what Jesus did. Back to the point of Tabitha. Back to the point of Dorcas. Why was she raised? Now remember, she wasn't resurrected. She was essentially resuscitated, because she did eventually die again. But why? Peter didn't. Jesus didn't just go walking around through Boot Hill or the Potter's Field raising everybody up. What's kind of awesome is that it wasn't for her benefit. It wasn't for her glory, but it would seem that it was for her ministry. How awesome is that? A lot of times we want the Lord to intervene or interdict. It's because we're tired of dealing with it. But what have we seen with the apostles and the disciples? Was it out of the oven and into the frying pan? We see these men being arrested, beaten, threatened. And when they are released, or when Peter goes to jail, and the angel comes down and lets Peter out of jail, what does the angel tell Peter? Go right back to the place where they arrested you, and you're going to continue preaching. For his benefit, for God's glory. And it came known throughout all Joppa, and many believed on the Lord. Just kind of a side point, I'm not entirely sure what the specifics of it would be, but it would seem that more was saved over the man who was paralyzed than from the woman being raised from the dead. Just brings up kind of that interesting note. Be careful how you're trying to assess your ministry. So it was that he stayed many days in Joppa with Simon a tanner. So we don't see Peter going all the way back down to Jerusalem. But instead we're shown our last point of some of the things that slow us down. And one of the first things that slow us down is those distractions. Those things are taking away our time with the Lord. But here in verse 43, we're starting to see something interesting with Peter. We see him starting to drop and to take off the shackles of tradition. Kind of an interesting thing for Peter, which gives us two awesome points. When we become Christians, when we become believers, when we accept the Lord, we get it in our heads, or it's taught to us, mistakenly, that right away you're going to be made whole. Right away you're going to be perfect. Those sins that are plaguing you, they're just right away going to go away. And you're all of a sudden going to be awesome. As awesome as that would be, it's kind of unrealistic. If you're building yourself up that way, that everything's going to go away right out the gate, that you're never going to make another mistake, you're never going to think another bad thought, as soon as you do make another mistake or think another bad thought, what's going to happen? I must not really be saved. Jesus must not love me. He didn't hear this particular prayer. Maybe I'm just kind of doing it wrong. I can't be holy in this church, so I'm going to go down the block to the next church, and maybe I can be holy in that church. Peter is a phenomenal example because I think a lot of us are a bunch of Peters. We have kind of that concept of always sticking our foot in our mouth. How many times did Peter stick his foot in his mouth? They see him feeding the 5,000. And Jesus is telling them, like, beware the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Beware that particular sin. What does Peter think? He's mad at me because we forgot the bread. So Peter tells him, why is it you're debating this one? Peter, James, and John go up with Jesus at the Mount of Transfiguration, and he sees Jesus just shining real bright. And what does Peter do? Lord, it's a good thing we're here. It's a good thing you brought me. Let's build 3 tabernacles. Let's build 3 pillars, one for all 3 of you. And it takes God to essentially shut him up. They come down from the Mount of Transfiguration, and we see him coming to the gates, and Jesus is asking the disciples, who does everyone say that I am? They say, well, you're a prophet, or you're Elijah, or you're the reincarnated John the Baptist. Jesus says, okay, well, who do you say that I am? And it's Peter. He speaks up. Well, you are the Christ, the Son of God. And Jesus is like, absolutely. How good for you. And then Jesus proceeds to tell him, he's like, well, I'm going to be lifted up. I'm going to be delivered into the hands, and I'm going to be killed. And on the 3rd day, I'll be back. So what does Peter do? Not so. Lord, there's no way that's going to happen. We're going to stop it. And Jesus tells him, get behind me, Satan. We will get to a place where in chapter 10, where the Lord is telling Peter, what I have called clean, you can't call unclean. Arise, kill, and eat. What's Peter going to tell him? No, I'm not going to do that, Lord. I've never eaten anything unclean. God has to do it 3 times. Simon a tanner. What does that mean that Peter is starting to take off those shackles of tradition? What does a tanner touch? Dead animals. It is an unclean and defiling profession. You had to live so far away from everybody else because essentially, almost like a leper, you're consistently defiling yourself by touching dead animals. It was so bad for those of us, and we'll be getting into it as we finish chapter 3 in Revelation, how important marriage was. The marriage covenant to God is incredibly important. And we see that as a running theme through the Word, how important marriage is. What God has joined together, let no man separate. We see all this heavy verbiage for the marriage. If I was a tanner, and I convinced some lucky gal to marry me, but she did not know I was a tanner, all the way up to that last step in marriage, they could break it off if she didn't know that her soon-to-be husband was a tanner. Just a big no-no. We see Peter staying with the tanner. Traditions inside the church are very poisonous. At least they can be. We as a body, we're still a young body, so we're still developing some of our own little traditions. This is what we're going to do for a harvest festival. This is what we're going to do for a Christmas message. This is what we're going to do with the kids for Resurrection Sunday. We see amazing things with traditions because they remind us of where we've come from, what Christ is, where we're going. It's one of those symbols that has just a hard time dying. But more often than not, we let those traditions become law. And the more rooted a law is, the less place for grace there is. So we see this whole thing with the law as we go from Genesis through Malachi, and we see the law and the law being used all over the place. You can kind of see, now that we have more information in the New Testament, the law was always pointing people towards God. It was always pointing people towards people. But we saw the law become so strict that not only did it cause people to stop loving people, but it caused other people to put wedges between others and God. How important it is to be less concerned about tradition. As a body, it's incredibly important for us to not be static. We get static, we get stale, we get lethargic. If you want to exercise that muscle, you have to be active. My friends, it's incredibly important, especially right now with the season that we're in, that the church is dynamic and engaging in any kind of venues that it possibly can. Cassie, you want to come up? As we take communion, where Kyle is at and where Gina is at is where cups are at. We're not going to pass it around because of the season that we're in right now. So I just invite, if you're with a family, one or two of you can go up and to the back and grab cups for your family, and then just hang on to the elements, and then we'll all take it together as a family.
Tis so sweet to trust in